around, and on my way back, I saw the emergency low fuel light had come on. So I descended straight away, and I saw a small, clear area where I thought I could land on a stretch of beach. It's called the forced landing, and there's a procedure to follow. You have to throw off the canopy hood so that you can quickly leave the plane. And when you descend, and the plane is touching down, you have to touch down in a stalling manner. And I did all of that, and I landed safe.
Ahmed had landed on a beach on a desolate and uninhabited stretch of the coast, and now found himself completely alone. Just him in his flight suit, standing next to his MiG-17 with no one in sight. Eventually, though, he met two rather surprised fishermen, who the next day took him by boat to Djibouti City, the capital. Ahmed had reached safety, but he knew there was now no way of going home.
I had a family. 3 children and a wife, my parents, my siblings that I had left behind in Somalia. It was difficult. My oldest child was 3, but it was a choice between 2 evils. Either kill people or escape to Djibouti.
Back in Hargeisa, meanwhile, the violence had continued. By the end of July 1988, Somali government forces had pushed the SNM rebels out of the city. But by this point, it had been almost completely destroyed, along with Burao, the other main city in the north. And government troops had also carried out mass executions of civilians, targeting members of the Issac clan. In all, it's estimated that more than 50,000 people were killed.
Most of Hargeisa's estimated population of 250,000 have sought refuge initially in the surrounding countryside, and the result has been a massive exodus across the border into Ethiopia.
Over the next few years, civil war in Somalia intensified. In 1991, the government finally collapsed, and in May that year, the SNM rebels unilaterally declared the north independent as the Republic of Somaliland. Ahmed, meanwhile, was able to reunite with his wife and children and start a new life in Luxembourg. In 2008, he made his first visit back to Hargeisa and was able to see a city that had been rebuilt. And Ahmed, you probably know this, but many people in Somaliland see you as a hero.
I cannot be called a hero. People are giving me what I don't deserve. I saw it as my duty.
Ahmed Mohammed Hassan, the pilot who refused to bomb Hargeisa, was talking to me, Rob Walker, for Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service, where we tackle the long-running and salacious stories that affect our lives.
In The Explanation, we look beyond the headlines so we can understand our world better. In this episode, we look at warfare in the 21st century. What is the Russian mercenary organization, the Wagner Group?
The Explanation. Sunday at 10:30 GMT. In half an hour, Fukushima. In episode 4, the stricken power plant is in meltdown and pressure levels are dangerously high, making the chances of another explosion all but certain. As the plant manager evacuates younger members of staff, teams are dispatched to vent the unstable reactors. The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 3 o'clock GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. Rescuers are racing to find the missing submersible near the wreck of the Titanic.
The Coast Guard has coordinated search efforts with the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guard, Air National Guard aircraft, and the Polar Prince, which has searched a combined 7,600 square miles, an area larger than the state of Connecticut.
The vessel is thought to have just over a day's worth of oxygen left. We have the latest from the search headquarters in Boston. Also on the newsroom.
I'm very proud of my son.
President Biden's son Hunter secures a plea deal to avoid jail time on minor gun and tax charges. A fight between rival gangs at a women's prison in Honduras has left more than 40 people dead. And later.
Lisbon is a great place where you can have the benefits of a city, but also be able to escape very quickly.
Like in Europe, it's kind of a cheap country to live in. We report on the digital nomads moving to Portugal. First, this update.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The operation to find a missing tourist submersible near the Titanic wreck is expanding to include more resources and private companies with expertise in deep-sea rescuing. The US Coast Guard says the 5 people on board now have less than 40 hours of oxygen left. The Coast Guard spokesman, Captain Jamie Frederick, said there's a huge effort being made to get heavy equipment to the search site.
There are several civilian ships that have offered services heading that way. There are additional Coast Guard cutters. We hope to have a Canadian Coast Guard cutter on scene this evening. We hope that they may be able to assume on-scene commander. Polar Prince has been doing a great job with those duties, but if we could take some of that from them, that would be good. I'm not going to get into talking about specific equipment. Frankly, I'm not an expert on what that equipment is, but we have experts in the Unified Command that are going through that, prioritizing what we need and then how we get it on scene.
The police in Honduras say more than 40 people have been killed at a women's prison during a clash between rival gangs. Reports say one of the gangs locked rival gang members in a cell and set fire to it. It saw 25 inmates burned to death. Others were shot. Honduras has a history of deadly prison incidents, often provoked by gang violence. Palestinian gunmen have killed 4 Israelis and wounded 4 more near a settlement in the occupied West Bank. Yolan Nell in Jerusalem has the details.
According to an Israeli military spokesman, 2 Palestinian gunmen opened fire in the forecourt of a petrol station and a roadside hummus restaurant close to the Israeli settlement of Eli. One was shot dead by an Israeli civilian at the scene, he said, while the other escaped in a stolen car but was later found and killed by Israeli forces. Both gunmen are said to have come from a village near Nablus and to have been affiliated with the Islamist militant group Hamas. A spokesman for Hamas didn't claim responsibility for the shooting, but said it was a response to an Israeli military raid in the northern West Bank city of Jenin a day ago, in which 6 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded.
President Joe Biden is meeting experts in San Francisco to discuss the promise and pitfalls of artificial intelligence. Mr. Biden told the gathering that there was a need to manage the risk AI poses to national security and the economy. He said we'll see more technological change in the next 10 years than in the previous 50. He also spoke about the dangers of AI on social media.
Social media has already shown us the harm that powerful technology can do without the right safeguards in place. That's why I said at the State of the Union that Congress needs to pass bipartisan privacy legislation to impose strict limits on personal data collection, ban targeting advertising toward children, and require companies to put health and safety first.
In February, President Biden directed U.S. federal agencies to promote balance in their use of new technologies, including AI. This is the world news from the BBC. The U.S. Senate has confirmed the nomination of a prominent pro-abortion lawyer to the Federal Appeals Court in Boston. Julie Reichelman argued on the losing side of the landmark Supreme Court case last year that ended a half-century of national right to abortion. President Biden nominated her a month after that decision. Western Australia is bringing in new laws to fully decriminalise abortion. They propose a raft of changes to the current abortion laws, some of the oldest in Australia. Phil Mercer has this report.
Medical staff or patients can face prosecution for ending a pregnancy that doesn't meet strict legal requirements. New reforms aim to fully decriminalise terminations. Later term procedures up to 24 weeks would be permitted. The current limit is 20 weeks. Mandatory counselling and the need for a doctor's referral would also be abolished. The Western Australian government says its new law will improve access to safe and timely care for patients. Some church groups have strongly opposed the changes.
Peruvian police have arrested a former prime minister for allegedly conspiring against the state and joining an attempted coup by the ousted President Pedro Castillo. Betsy Chavez was detained at her home in the southern city of Tacna. She's denied having knowledge of the alleged coup. Other former ministers of Mr. Castillo's government are under investigation for fomenting rebellion. The largest US newspaper chain is suing Google for allegedly monopolizing ad technology for the online advertising market. In a complaint filed in Manhattan's federal court, the Gannett Group, which owns more than 200 daily newspapers, accused Google of controlling tools for buying and selling online ads. Google has argued publishers have many options for advertising technology and keep the vast majority of the revenue. That's the latest BBC News.
Thank you. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. It is now 63 hours since the Titan submersible began its dive to the wreck of the Titanic, meaning it should have just over a day's worth of oxygen left. Communication with the craft was lost less than 2 hours into the mission on Sunday morning. US and Canadian aircraft have been searching some 20,000 square kilometres of the North Atlantic in case it's managed to return to the surface. A commercial vessel with a remote underwater vehicle is also at the scene, and other ships are on their way. US Coast Guard Captain Jamie Frederick had this update from Search Headquarters in Boston.
Since Sunday, the Coast Guard has coordinated search efforts with the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guard, Air National Guard aircraft, and the Polar Prince, which has searched a combined 7,600 square miles, an area larger than the state of Connecticut. These search efforts have focused on both surface, with C-130 aircraft searching by sight and with radar, and subsurface, with P-3 aircraft were able to drop and monitor sonar buoys. To date, those search efforts have not yielded any results.
Our correspondent Nomia Iqbal is in the Canadian province of Newfoundland, some 600 kilometres from the site of the Titanic wreck. She says conditions at the scene are challenging.
Officials say this is the worst spring since 1943. Visibility is incredibly low. It is so foggy, but the teams are continuing this race against time to try and find the missing submersible. Just to remind you of the scale of it, so the Titanic wreckage is about 400 miles of the coast of Newfoundland, and diving experts will tell you that the depth of the ocean that they're trying to search is less explored than outer space. Now, earlier I spoke to Newfoundland's Premier, Andrew Fury, and he said to me that this province is sadly used to maritime tragedies given its history, given its location, and given its relationship with the Titanic. However, he said this doesn't make it any easier to fathom what has happened.
Nomia Iqbal in the Canadian province of Newfoundland. Well, a number of passengers who've been on previous trips on the submersible say there were problems with communications. It's also emerged that an expert who worked for the vessel's operator, OceanGate, warned of potential safety problems back in 2018. A short while ago, I got the latest from our correspondent on the US Atlantic coast, Carl Nassman.
Here, night has fallen in Boston, and this is where those search operations are being coordinated with the U.S. Coast Guard, with Canadian officials, with the U.S. Navy, as well as commercial vessels, and any other boat that might have been in the area and was willing to lend a hand. We have not heard or seen any sign of the Titan yet and those 5 people on board, and it certainly is a complex operation. That's what we've been hearing from the Coast Guard themselves. In fact, at their press conference earlier today, they pretty much admitted that they don't have on their own the technicalities, the complex machinery, and the know-how in order to carry out this kind of search and rescue operation. And that's why we're seeing so many partners and so many different countries being brought in to assist with this operation.
Yeah, and take us through the twin aspects of it, because on the one hand, they're looking in the hope that it's on the surface somewhere, but it may also be in the depths.
Well, that's what part of what makes this so complicated in terms of a search mission. There's a few different scenarios. This vessel could easily be trapped underneath the surface. There's some speculation that maybe it got caught up in some sort of netting. Maybe it's caught in the wreckage of the Titanic itself. It could also well have actually emerged from the depths. It could be floating somewhere in this vast ocean. We've heard from the Coast Guard that they're searching an ocean, a part of the ocean that's the size of the U.S. state of Connecticut. So that is a very wide area to be searching, and the hopes are that they will indeed find potentially something at the surface.
Now, over the past couple of days, we've heard about the submersible itself, what it's like inside, but now a few details beginning to emerge about possible questions about its safety record.
There have been some emerging questions. The New York Times has been reporting that there was this industry group that wrote an open letter to the CEO of OceanGate expressing concerns about what they considered to be an experimental approach. That was back in 2018. We've also, of course, seen footage of the actual vessel, this submersible itself. And even the CEO himself admitted that there were some parts that were put together, even the joystick used to control the Submersible is essentially a video game controller. So this is in many ways an experimental sea craft.
Carl Massman in Boston. When the search began, US officials were reluctant to comment on exactly who was taking part in the trip to the Titanic, which costs $250,000 per person. But we now know the identities of those on board the craft, as I heard from the newsroom's Peter Goffin.
The mission is being led by the American businessman Stockton Rush, who owns and runs Ocean Gate. That's the company that designed the submersible and arranged the journey. Mr. Rush is a former jet pilot with an aerospace engineering degree from Princeton University. The company says he oversees the engineering strategy for all its deep-sea submersibles, and he reportedly goes on every one of its dives. Now, Ocean Gate has been offering these trips to the Titanic since 2021, and we heard from someone who's made the trip twice with the company. Fred Hagen bristled at the idea that this is just a tourist experience. He said everyone on board is a trained crew member and an investor in Mr. Rush's vision for deep-sea exploration.
Stockton Rush is a visionary. He was trying to take humanity where it had never gone before. It's an area of the world that is largely unexplored, and it's critical to the future of this planet and our efforts to combat climate change, because lithium and all these other elements that are so important to our future are at the bottom of the ocean. We have to sort out how to access them without degrading the bottom of the ocean. That is the vision. That's what Stockton was pursuing. And he was using destinations like the Titanic to captivate interest, to get people fascinated by going into the abyss.
Fred Hagen, who's saying it's not at all about tourism. So what are the people there for? Tell us who is on board.
Well, I've heard one journalist describe the passengers as wealthy risk takers, and that seems especially fitting for Hamish Harding. He's a British, Cambridge-educated billionaire. He owns a private jet dealership in Dubai. He's also one of the world's great adventurers. Guinness World Records calls him the first person ever to reach the extremes of land, sea, and air, which is to say that he's climbed Mount Everest, he's dived to the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, and he's gone to space, which he did last year on Jeff Bezos' rocket. There's also a second seasoned explorer on the submersible. That's the former French Navy diver Paul-Henri Narjolet. He's been nicknamed Mr. Titanic because at age 77, he's made more expeditions to the shipwreck than anyone else, including a previous trip on the Titan submersible. And he's also the director of underwater research for the U.S. company that owns the salvage rights to the site of the wreck.
And we also know that a father and son are taking the trip.
That's right. That's Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son, Suleiman, who are on board. They're British citizens and also members of one of the richest families in Pakistan. Shahzada, the father, is a businessman, a board member of a major producer of fertilizer. He's also an advisor to the Prince's Trust International, which is a charity founded by King Charles. And he's a trustee for the SETI Institute. That's a U.S.-based nonprofit group that searches for signs of extraterrestrial life. Now, we've heard less about his son, who's still only a teenager. We do know from the family, though, that he has a passion for science fiction stories and playing volleyball. Just small snippets of a life there, but they are a reminder of the people at the center of this search that's captured so much attention over the past few days.
Peter Goffin reporting. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Honduras, along with its neighbours El Salvador and Guatemala, is plagued by violence between drug gangs. Its murder rate is 4 times the global average. Now, a gang fight inside a women's prison near the Honduran capital Tegucigalpa has left at least 41 people dead. Reports suggested that one group started a fire in a cell holding their rivals. President Xiomara Castro has launched a crackdown on the gangs, and the Deputy Security Minister, Julissa Villanueva, said the prison fight should be seen as an attack on the government itself.
Sin duda alguna, lo ocurrido hoy. There is no doubt that today's unfortunate events are the result of an attempt by organized crime gangs to try and thwart government measures to control gang violence.
Hundreds of relatives have gathered outside the women's jail, desperate for news. I heard more about what happened from our South America correspondent, Katie Watson.
There was a fight that started
between two rival gangs. And the rival gangs in Honduras are the Mara Salvatrucha, known as MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang. So after that fight broke out, a fire was then deliberately started. It's believed that it was started by one gang in the cell of another, and it was the fire that swept through a part of the prison that is believed to be completely destroyed, and that's the reason for such a high death toll. The majority of people died because of the fire. Some were shot. There were some who were also taken to hospital for treatment.
And are there questions being asked as to why the authorities allowed this to happen?
In Honduras, there's been a history of prison riots. It's not a new thing. The level of gang violence is increasingly worrying. I mean, along with neighbours El Salvador, Guatemala, it's a direct trafficking route from South America for Colombian cocaine into the US. And gang violence has soared in the past few years. It's seen a terrifying homicide rates believed to be in Honduras alone about 4 times higher than the world average. So this is not new. Since the new government has come in, there's certainly been a promise to tackle criminal gangs, but nevertheless, of course, it's a difficult issue to crack, especially in such a violent region of the world.
Yeah, I mean, tell us more about the president's effort to crack down on this. That the Deputy Security Minister says that this incident is a direct attack against the government of this woman who has the political will to take action.
Also, Xiomara Castro, when she came to power, she promised that she'd tackle criminal gangs. She even lifted certain guarantees in the Constitution that would allow police to make arrests without warrant. I mean, it's the number one issue in the region, and how to be able to crack down on it without being able to, tackle the source of the problem, which is the drug trade, and that the route through the countries is, to be honest, an impossible task. But each country and each new government tries to deal with it in the way that they can. But of course, the corruption and the violence goes right to the very top. It's within the government institutions as well. And I think that's the biggest challenge that these countries have.
Our Latin America correspondent Katie Watson. President Biden's son looks set to avoid a jail term after reaching a plea deal on minor tax and gun charges. Hunter Biden, who has a history of drug abuse, said it was important for him to take responsibility for his mistakes. However, the Republicans say the 53-year-old has been let off lightly. The agreement still needs to be approved by a federal judge. Our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue told us more about what Hunter Biden has agreed to.
He's only going to plead guilty to 2 charges, 2 misdemeanor charges relating to unpaid taxes in 2017 and 2018. The third charge, which is a felony charge, therefore more serious, relates to a 10-day period where he had a gun, which he wasn't allowed to have a handgun because he was a drug addict at the time, and that was illegal. They're allowing him to agree to have treatment and to effectively avoid any kind of other criminal charges for 2 years, and that will be put on what's called a diversion, which means effectively the charge won't actually be brought when it actually comes to court.
So he won't have to go to jail?
No, he won't go to jail. He's already paid a number of the fines related to the tax misdemeanors and repaid the taxes themselves, we're told. The conditions put on the gun charge seem to are designed to keep him out of jail. This was a much wider investigation. There are all sorts of things these federal prosecutors looked into over 5 years. The whole business of Hunter Biden's relationship, the accusations about him leveraging his father's name in Ukraine and China, issues of money laundering, all this kind of thing, the laptop, of course, and really what we've come down to are these 2 minor tax charges and the gun charge. So, as you can imagine, the Republicans are saying that this is something of a whitewash, a slap on the wrist, as they're all calling it.
Yes, and a sort of 2-tier justice system, they believe.
Yeah, they've been saying for a while that the justice system has been weaponized by the Biden administration. It's become partisan, that Donald Trump, for example, is treated in one way, they say, and he's facing federal criminal charges and state criminal charges, as we know, whereas they say Hunter Biden was treated very differently. And of course, while this sort of legal process may have come to an end, or there's some dispute about that even, congressional Republicans are continuing to investigate Hunter Biden, trying to dig up documents, writing reports, because they, of course, control the committees in Congress at the moment, and that means they can shape that particular agenda. So that will not just carry on. I think in some ways that will be fueled by this resolution.
Our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue talking to James Menendez. Now time for the latest sports news with Andy Barber.
And the opening men's Ashes cricket test proved to be a real thriller, and it was Australia who came out on top, chasing a target of 281. They got home to defeat England by 2 wickets at Edgbaston in Birmingham.
Cummins is back and plays it on the squirt towards third man. He's running out towards the boundary. That's it. It's gone for 4. Australia have won an extraordinary victory. Cummins is doing a half lap of honour. He's going to come over and pick up Nathan Lyon. What about that? Unbelievable that Australia have won this game.
Yes, skipper Pat Cummins was Australia's hero there, leading his side and hitting those winning runs as they went 1-0 up in the 5-match test series. Cummins says that the key was playing the game at their own pace and tempo.
Never thought of a draw, no. Yeah, there was different periods where it felt really tough to get runs. You know, I think when we were 70 away, it felt a long way away. But, you know, a couple of boundaries and suddenly the field spreads and you can pick over a couple of singles. So, yeah, I can't really remember any of it, to be honest.
England pace bowler James Anderson felt proud to have been part of such an exciting test match in the Ashes history, but ultimately he was disappointed with the outcome.
We tried to dominate the game from ball one. That declaration on day one, you know, I thought was really positive. And we fought on what was a really classic pitch. And, we did some great stuff, as I said. Great to Australia today. They were just too good for us.
Football news now. The Portugal captain Cristiano Ronaldo scored a last-minute winner in their 1-0 European Championship qualifying victory away to Iceland. He became the first men's player to win 200 international caps. But that was also Ronaldo's 123rd international goal, extending his world record there. Moldova ranked 171 in the world, stunned Poland as they came back from being 2-0 down to win 3-2. That was only Moldova's second qualifying victory since 2013. Guinea qualified for the Africa Cup of Nations, all thanks to a goalless draw in the game between Ethiopia and Malawi. Burundi kept alive their hopes of reaching the tournament by beating Namibia 3-2. Mauritania, they went top of Group I with 1 match day left. 3-0 winners over Sudan. Elsewhere, the Euro 2024 host nation Germany fell to a second straight friendly international defeat. They were beaten 2-0 at home by Colombia, and Sadio Mane scored twice as Senegal defeated Brazil 4-2 in a game played in Lisbon. And some transfer news. Chelsea and France forward midfield player N'Golo Kante has agreed to become the latest player to join the Saudi Arabian champions Al Ittihad. That's the sport.
Andy, thank you. Remote working has been on the rise for a while, but it really took off with the COVID pandemic, with some countries cashing in from new visitors. In October, Portugal introduced a special visa allowing remote workers to stay for up to 5 years and giving them tax benefits. Since then, thousands of so-called digital nomads have made Portugal their home office. But some locals aren't happy. Our reporter Kieran Tracy sent this report from Lisbon.
That was the sound of one of Lisbon's perfect-looking yellow dolly trams whistling along the lines that crisscross the city. And it's brought me to somewhere that I think is where the digital nomad dream can crystallizes. Guys and girls sitting in the windows with their laptops open. The sea is like 300 yards from here. The internet connections are fast, the food is great, and there are people of every nationality zoning into their laptops in an atmosphere that could only be described as chill.
And actually Lisbon is a great place where you can have the benefits and all that of the city, but also be able to escape very quickly to more like a beach surf kind of lifestyle.
Like in Europe, it's kind of a cheap country to live in. Now the rent is kind of expensive, but all the other things are like half price from Germany, France, or nice for us, you know.
It is nice, but it hasn't always been, especially if you're a local.
Katerina Carvalho should know. She's a respected editor and the founder of the online newsroom Mensager. She explains why the government needed to do something, anything, to get money into the country.
Because we were in the middle of a big crisis. This was a good idea then because it was an influx of money coming to Portugal from foreigners, people coming here, people who were wealthy, who could afford to consume things. That's what we needed the most.
Across town, I head to a shaded square that is just full of Latin character. Where we are right now is the last local square in this village. This is Antonio Brito Guterres. He's an academic in urban development, but he's also worked on Lisbon streets for years.
All the squares in Lisbon, they are not like this. You cannot buy a coffee for 70 cents. So it changed a lot.
He thinks more effort should have been given to raising the living standards for the people who live here permanently, not the people who are only going to stop by.
Imagine, now the public space is full of places to consume. They are too expensive.
Didn't need preferential treatment. Lisbon's place on the coast, its rambling, easy vibe, mean that workers would and will be attracted here anyway. Do they really need a special visa?
No, you don't, because imagine, the same street I'm describing to you, the same street, imagine that you have people that are just there 1 year, or are just there 2 weeks. You know, you don't engage, so for example, you don't care so much about the street, somebody will solve it. You don't care so much about the older people.
A report from Portugal by Kieran Tracy. Returning to our main news now, the search for the submersible taking 5 people to see the wreck of the Titanic. The doomed liner has fascinated people for decades. Many films have been made, and some have devoted their entire careers to the ship. But why? Charlotte Gallagher reports.
The maiden voyage of the Titanic in 1912 attracted huge crowds, thousands crammed into the English city of Southampton to wave off what they believed was an unsinkable vessel. But 4 days into the journey to New York, the huge ocean liner hit an iceberg and sank. And over 100 years later, people are still fascinated by the story. Some who are rich enough willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to the wreck in a tiny submersible. James Cameron, who wrote and directed the film Titanic in 1997, has visited the wreck more than 30 times. He told the Discovery Channel about the experience.
It wasn't a legend anymore. It was a real place. It was a real place where real people had died, where a real tragic event had taken place. And something about looking out at the deck, at this rusty deck that barely looks like anything, and knowing that that's right where the Titanic band had played, it just had a huge effect on me.
There have been other horrendous shipwrecks, but none have quite captured the imagination like the Titanic has. The fact that people from all walks of life were on board could be one factor, from tycoons to musicians and manual labourers. Letters from passengers and crew also reveal so much about life on the ship, the opulence of the first-class cabins, and even the menus in the restaurants. That has provided so much rich material for filmmakers like James Cameron and ensures the legend of the Titanic lives on.
Charlotte Gallagher, quick update. The CNN and the Times are reporting that banging sounds have been heard during the search for the missing submersible. And that's it for now from me and the team on the newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're following an incredible journey.
Eritrea's Billionaire has made cycling history at the Giro d'Italia, and he's become the first black African rider to win a stage at a Grand Tour. This is the biggest victory of the 22-year-old's career so far.
Last year, Billionaire made history, and he's on the brink of making it again. He could be the first black African to win a stage for the world's biggest race, the Tour de France.
It would be massive for African cycling. That would be a big milestone.
He's making a name for our country.
At this moment, inspiring a lot of people over there in Africa.
Bini is out of category.
How has the Eritrean become one of the most talented cyclists in the sport's history? And what challenges has he faced coming up in this sport?
Language is a challenge. Culture. Food is a challenge.
I'm Matt Warwick. I'm following Binny's journey to the finish line.
Binny, Africa's new hero. Tuesday at 8:30 and 19 GMT. Coming up after the news on the BBC World Service, we continue our drama series Fukushima about Japan's 2011 nuclear disaster. In episode 4, the stricken power plant is in meltdown and pressure levels are dangerously high, making the chances of another explosion all but certain. As the plant manager evacuates younger members of staff, teams are dispatched to vent the unstable reactors. Join us after the news when Fukushima continues.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. The operation to find a missing tourist submersible near the Titanic wreck is expanding to include more resources and private companies with expertise in deep-sea rescuing. The US Coast Guard says the 5 people on board now have just over a day's worth of oxygen left. Vessels and planes are scouring the area, some dropping sonar buoys to monitor a depth of nearly 4,000 meters. The Honduran President Xiomara Castro has expressed shock at what she called the monstrous murder of at least 41 people at a women's prison during a clash between rival gangs. She said she would hold security leaders to account. Palestinian gunmen have killed 4 Israelis and wounded 4 more near a settlement in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that all options are open in mounting a response. The US State Department has condemned the attack on Israelis. President Biden has told a meeting of experts in San Francisco there was a need to address the risk that artificial intelligence poses to national security and the economy. Peruvian police have arrested a former prime minister for allegedly joining an attempted coup by the ousted President Pedro Castillo. Betsy Chavez has denied having knowledge of the alleged coup attempt. Western Australia is bringing in new laws to fully decriminalise abortion. The new legislation proposes a raft of changes to the state's current abortion laws, which are some of the oldest in Australia. The US Senate has confirmed the nomination of Julie Reichelman, a prominent pro-abortion lawyer, to the Federal Appeals Court in Boston. The largest US newspaper chain, Gannett, is suing Google for allegedly monopolizing ad technology for the online advertising market. The complaint echoes similar ones filed against Google by the US Department of Justice and the EU. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is episode 4 of our drama series, Fukushima.